Okay, well, let's begin with what I think was actually a genuine surprise, a surprise of sorts. There was a leak, which we didn't quite believe, but it is true. The Switch 2 display isn't just a 7.9 slash 8-inch 1080p display. It's much more than that. Oliver, I'm going to go to you to talk about the specs here because there's stuff here that we kind of had ruled out a couple of weeks ago. But yes, it is true. There is HDR, there is VRR. It's quite impressive, right?
Yeah. So there was a rumor about, I think last week, basically, that there was going to be an HDR, VRR, and 120 hertz screen on the Switch 2, which we had kind of thought was a little bit unlikely given Nintendo's priorities and their tendency to go for more cost-effective solutions here. But indeed, that is what's happened. We have an LCD, a 7.9-inch LCD, according to Nintendo. It has HDR support, it has VRR support, and 120 hertz output. Now, that HDR support part is curious because, HDR support notionally does not do a whole lot for you without some kind of selective backlight control. So this would probably have to be a mini LED panel, presumably to work effectively if it is indeed mini LED LCD. That could be quite compelling here. It'll be interesting to see 120 hertz support. You'll probably see games that do support different kinds of frame rate modes. You'd presume more like in the 40 FPS range, but again, you have VRR, so you kind of have some, quite a lot of configurability and quite a lot of potential there, especially if they have good, I would presume they would have good LFC support there as well. But that combination of VR, HDR, 120 hertz, and 1080p, it is a very compelling mobile screen. It could be one of the very best mobile screens around for a handheld device of this type. It's not an OLED panel, presumably, but that is not, it has a lot of other elements here that make it quite strong. Again, if it is a mini LED panel and if it can achieve a really good HDR presentation, that is quite compelling, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is interesting because obviously we've seen a mobile VRR panel 1080p before in the Asus ROG Ally. Typically, you don't game at 120 frames per second or anything close to it, but it does give you a lot of leeway in running unlocked frame rates, which is a really interesting proposition. Not that we actually saw any of that in the presentation with the game software that we saw. But John, at the same time, well, first of all, I'm curious about your thoughts about this display, but secondly, interesting stuff with the docked resolution output as well.
Yeah, right. So, yes, my thoughts on the display is that it sounds delightfully wonderful, actually. And, having used mini LED LCDs with HDR, they can still look very, very good. So there is a chance that this could be an absolutely excellent screen. I think the concern around LCD was that they would return to something like the Switch 1, which was a dreadful LCD panel. And so it doesn't sound like that's the case. And VRR being built in at the screen system portable level is really interesting because it suggests that we're just going to see it across the board in games, which is going to make life for us a little tough, but it should at least smooth things out a lot.
Yeah.
Because, we're going to see unstable games in the system. That's how it always goes, right? It's varies per developer. So this could help a lot. And the 120 hertz refresh rate is key for low frame rate compensation support. Mm-hmm. But the docked stuff, this one is really weird to me. And so it would seem that this is limited to an HDMI 2.0 adjacent chip in terms of what it can output, because very clearly during the presentation they specified that 4K at 60 frames per second was the maximum output it could support. Yeah. 120 hertz support is there, but only at lower resolutions. But when they mentioned it, it was with Metroid, I think, and so it's not clear. HDMI 2.0 can do 1440p at 120 as well. So conceivably, that could work because 1440p was shown in our first peek at the system settings menu, which is very similar to Switch, but a little bit sharper, some changes to the colors and whatnot. But still, I'm a little bummed out that they did not opt for that full 4K 120 HDMI 2.1 chipset, because that means we also won't be able to get 4K 60 HDR will have chroma subsampling forced, essentially. Which is a bummer, I think. Not a huge one, but it is something to consider. The dock itself, though, is interesting because it is noticeably larger. And my first thought, wow, it looks like a taco with that shape. But the rear of the dock is much thicker because this time it actually houses a proper fan.
Yes.
What do you I mean, so I'm curious what you think about that, Rich, because this gets into the whole thermals and such. It's just something the original Switch just relied on that single high pitched fan jammed in there at the top, I believe. And now they're actually bringing extra cooling in. And I'm wondering how effective you think this will be, considering that it has to sort of penetrate the shell of the Switch itself, and like what that could really do for performance.
I'm going to be interested to see where the fans align with the unit and what
Right.
ventilation there is at the unit itself. But what do we know about the Switch 2 that's not been officially confirmed yet? Well, it's got presumably an 8 nanometer Samsung chip in it, which is quite large, in the region of about 200 square millimeters, which is large for a mobile part. And I would assume that because it's not exactly a cutting edge fabrication node, it's going to get hot when you upclock it. I think the clocks that we're looking at for the GPU are in the region of 1 gigahertz. And, in a tight, small form factor like that, you need to dissipate that heat. So I guess that's why we've got the active cooling on the fan there. I just hope it's not too noisy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Obviously, there's going to be a bit of a completely noise-free fan. That would be quite the thing. I'm just looking at some supporter questions here. And Crushnator is asking, Nintendo didn't speak much about the dock, but they did show it contained active cooling. What does the DF team think about the difference between docked and undocked settings? If the new dock seems beefier than the original, I would suspect that the gap will be quite wide, perhaps wider than the original Switch. Will this open the door for a larger gap in visuals between docked and undocked? Quite possibly. Metroid Prime 4 mentioned 4K at 60 FPS. I wonder if those settings might only be in docked mode, for example, or obviously.
One would presume.
It hasn't got a 4K screen. That'd be some tremendous super sampling, though.
It would.
This question from some guy person, if you look at the back of the dock, it says the output power is 15 volts at 2.8 amps, which gives us 42 watts of power to work with, presumably in docked mode. That's a lot more headroom than you were expecting, right? I guess I should add that the overall input power is 20 volts at 3 amps, 60 watts. So some of that power delta is going to things like the built-in Ethernet port, the fan, and the additional USB ports, which is all fair enough, but it does seem to point towards quite a wide gap between mobile and docked. 42 watts would be kind of nuts, though.
Did you notice, by the way, Rich, that they very explicitly say that you cannot use a Switch 1 charging adapter with the Switch 2 for powering the dock? Right, it says it's compatible with charging only, so it does not.
The original Switch 1 power brick has a 39 watt capacity, I believe.
Yep.
This would be quite a bit higher than that.
Exactly. So that's interesting.
Any thoughts on the dock there, Oliver?
No, it certainly is interesting to see that fan there, especially considering the housing of the Switch 2 appears to be a plastic housing generally. So I kind of wonder if that might be in part or in large part to keep the kind of skin temperature down, to make the device more comfortable to use. Because ultimately, given that the back presumably is not made out of some kind of heat transmissive metal, alloy, aluminum, whatever, it's not actually going to be doing a whole lot for the temperatures of that internal SoC, I would imagine. So it's probably a portion of this at least is to keep that skin temperature down to improve the comfort of the unit, I would expect.